The Bible tells us that when Jesus was here on earth, he taught people about God and how to live their lives so they could experience more of God. And he taught them in very ordinary settings. Most of us think that we need to be on top of a mountain or at least in a special place to hear from God. But that's not what the Bible teaches. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Jesus would take simple things like fishing or eating or traveling and turn them into extraordinary lessons. So let's look at 4 ways that Jesus turned ordinary moments into extraordinary lessons. 1. Jesus used nature to teach people about God. This is what we read in Matthew chapter 14, verses 23 to 25. And when the disciples got into the boat and were crossing over to the other side, they saw Jesus walking toward them over the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "Don't be afraid." And when he had come into the boat, the wind and the waves ceased. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "You are truly the Son of God." Now, what happened here was that Jesus was walking on the water. He probably didn't have to walk on the water, but for some reason he decided to do so. But the disciples were in a boat and they were having a hard time rowing because the wind and the waves were against them. So Jesus walks up to them and says, "Don't be afraid, it's me." And this was a supernatural event because walking on the water is not natural. And yet Jesus made this moment a normal moment by telling them not to be afraid. Because sometimes our fear can paralyze us. And Jesus wanted to show them that, although this was an extraordinary moment, he was in control of the situation. They just needed to put their trust in him. And then once they recognized that it was Jesus, they stopped being afraid. And when he stepped into the boat, the wind and the waves stopped. And again, he took something that was extraordinary, which was walking on the water, and he turned it into an ordinary moment. Now, look at what happens right after this event. It says that those who were in the boat worshipped him and called him the Son of God. So not only did Jesus make this an ordinary moment, but he also used this extraordinary moment to reveal something more about himself to his disciples. So if you think about it, sometimes we don't have to go anywhere special or do anything special to know God. God will use everyday moments to reveal himself to us. And number 2, Jesus used meals to teach people about God. In Luke chapter 7 and verse 36, it says one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to eat with him. And he went in and sat down, and look at what happens. It says in verse 36 that a woman who had been a sinner in that city, having heard that he ate with sinners, came there and brought an alabaster box of ointment. Now, she stood at his feet, weeping, and began to wash his feet with her tears. And she wiped them with the hair of her head and kissed his feet and anointed them with the ointment. Now, the one who had invited him saw this and took offense and said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would know who and what manner of woman this is who is touching him." Now, what happened here was that a woman who had a reputation of being a sinner wanted to come and worship Jesus. The Pharisee thought to himself, if Jesus was a true prophet, he would know who this woman is and what she has done in the past. But notice the actions of this woman. She washed his feet with her tears, she wiped his feet with her hair, and then she anointed his feet with expensive perfume. And this was a way of showing her devotion and her love to Jesus. But the Pharisee couldn't see beyond the sin in this woman's life. He only saw her past, but Jesus saw her heart. Now, this is very important because it tells us that Jesus could have easily made this a very uncomfortable moment for this woman, but he didn't. He allowed her to do what she wanted to do, and he even allowed her to anoint him so that he could be fragrant. And I think that this shows us that Jesus did not despise sinners. He never looked down on them, and he never rejected them. And this meal turned into an opportunity for Jesus to teach the Pharisee a lesson about humility and faith. Now, look at verse 49. It says that when Jesus saw the reaction of the Pharisee, he told him a parable. "Do you see this woman?" he asked. "I have 49 other sheep that are just like her. They have all strayed away, but I came to seek and save what was lost." So Jesus took this meal and turned it into an opportunity to teach the Pharisees about compassion. And I think that this is very important for us to remember because most of us love to judge other people. We want to point out the bad in someone else's life. But if we really want to follow Jesus, we must follow his example. We must look beyond the sin in someone's life and see their heart. Number 3, Jesus used journeys to teach people about God. Look at what happened in Luke chapter 10. It says, "After this, the Lord appointed 70 others and sent them out ahead of him in pairs to every town and village. He said to them, 'The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest field. Go your way. I am sending you out as lambs among wolves. Carry no purse or bag or sandals or staff, for the sake of him who sent you. Blessed are you when men hate you and when they exclude you and revile you and spit you out. Yes, blessed are you when they do all these things because of my name. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy. For behold, your reward is great in heaven. For my Father so desires to give the kingdom to you.'" So Jesus gathered his disciples, and he sent them out on a journey. And before he sent them out, he gave them some very important instructions. For one, he told them that they should pray for more workers to go and do this work. Then he told them to go out without any money or supplies. And why? Well, because he wanted them to focus on the task that he had given them. So basically, he was telling them, hey, Don't get distracted by other things. Just do the work that I've given you to do. And then he told them that they would face persecution because of his name. And he warned them that people might hate them, exclude them, revile them, and even spit them out. But you know what he told them to do? He told them to rejoice in that day and to leap for joy. Why? Well, because their reward in heaven would be great. So basically, Jesus took this journey and turned it into an extraordinary lesson about obedience and persecution. Now, many of us think that following Jesus will be easy, but the Bible teaches us that it won't always be easy. In fact, Jesus told his disciples that if people hated them, it meant that they loved the Father and that they were following Jesus. So if you're going through hard times, if people hate you, if you feel like they're against you, Jesus wants you to know that it's all part of the journey. It's all part of following him. And this doesn't just apply to us as Christians, but it applies to us as pastors as well. For instance, last week I was doing a Bible study for the pastoral staff at our church, and as I was studying the word, I noticed that Moses was called a murderer in the Bible, and I was like, wait a minute. I thought Moses was a good guy. I thought he led Israel out of Egypt. I thought he was a great leader and a great prophet. How was he called a murderer? So I started looking into this, and I realized that Moses was called a murderer because he killed an Egyptian. And he did this before he was called to be a prophet. But I discovered that the Bible calls him a murderer. Exodus 2, verse 12 says, "And it came to pass in those days that when Moses was of age, he went out to his people and looked out at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. So he asked him, 'Why are you doing this?' Then the Egyptian said to him, 'What is your business?' And he said, 'Why do you beat your fellow Hebrew?' So he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no one around, he struck the Egyptian and killed him and hid him in the sand. So Moses tried to defend his people. He didn't like seeing them be mistreated. So he killed this Egyptian, but he didn't tell anyone. And when 40 years later he tries to help his people again, God reminds him of this event and he tells him, 'Hey Moses, you're a murderer. You cannot lead my people.' So for 40 years, Moses was not able to enter the promised land because of this event in his past. Now, I ask you, does this discourage you or does this encourage you? Well, I believe that this should encourage us because although Moses made a huge mistake, he still became one of the greatest heroes of faith in the Bible. Even though he was a murderer, God still used him to deliver his people. And even though he wasn't perfect, God still used him to lead his people to the promised land. So this encourages me because it shows me that I do need to be perfect to be used by God. I don't need to have everything together to be used by God. If anything, this should encourage us to keep moving forward because God can use us despite our mistakes, our weaknesses, and our sins. So I hope that this encourages you today. May it remind you that you don't need to be perfect to be used by God. And may it remind you that if people hate you or if you go through persecution, rejoice, because that means that you're following Jesus.